Hi, everyone. We're going to give this a couple more minutes and let additional folks log in before we start, but we're queued up and ready to go. We don't actually have to be quiet. We can say we're just giving people a couple minutes to log in. I don't know about everybody else, but you know, I don't always make things right on the minute when they start. Although I was here on time today, I'll have you know.
Well, WebEx has a little download step that always catches me off guard.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah, you think you're on time and then you're staring at the computer going, come on, catch up. Well, according to my clock here in the Central Time Zone, it is 1:02, so I think we'll go ahead and start. Before we start, I just want to let everyone on the call know that we are recording this session, and everyone who registered, whether you show up or not, if you've registered, we'll send out an email with a link to the recording. Additionally, we will be taking questions throughout the session. If you can type those into the question box, and we'll be getting to your questions either as we go or at the end. I'm Vicki Driver. I'm the director of the CogAT program here at Riverside Insights. And over the next few weeks, possibly even next few months, we are launching a series of webinars to allow you, the folks out there in the field doing the work, to hear from your peers. And our purpose for these sessions is to give you an opportunity to hear from folks who do jobs similar to you, so that you can get an overview of how other districts and systems are dealing with some of the same kinds of issues that you deal with on a day-to-day basis, particularly with respect to the work that you're doing around your gifted and talented programming. Our session today features Dr. Tanya Lyon, who you should be able to see on your screen. Tanya is the Talent Development Coordinator for the Mankato Area Public Schools in Mankato, Minnesota, and they refer to themselves as MAPS. So when she mentions MAPS, she's referring to Mankato Area Public Schools. Tanya is currently serving as the president of the Minnesota Educators of Gifted and Talented Executive Board. She also serves as a member of the Gifted and Talented Advisory Board for the Minnesota Department of Education. In 2018, Tanya was recognized as one of the National Association for Gifted Children's, NAGC's, Coordinators of the Year. And for NAGC, Tanya is currently developing and chairing a new coordinator special interest group. And in the past, she served as a co-chair of the local action committee for NAGC in Minneapolis. And she spent a couple of years serving on the NAGC conference program planning committee as well. She's additionally been a presenter at NAGC every year for the last several years, including working with Riverside at last year's conference. Now, one of the things that we know at NAGC, because we experience it ourselves, is that people get pulled in a lot of different directions. You have competing sessions. This year, NAGC's conference is virtual, so we may have a chance to dip in or view recorded sessions, but usually you make it to the live session or you don't. We had a great presentation last year with Mankato Area Public Schools, and we wanted to provide a venue for more folks to have a chance to hear about the really interesting and important work that is happening in Mankato Area Public Schools with respect to what they've done around differentiated identification practices and differentiated service models. So we were always planning to do another session with Dr. Lyon and the folks from Mankato Area Public Schools, and then COVID happened. So that's added a new twist to this year. So one of the topics that we will talk about today as well is how the work in MAPS has been affected this year by the new COVID protocols that we've all had to put in place. Also on your screen, you can see that Dr. Joni Lyon has joined us today on this session. And if we're really lucky, one or more of her cats may join us too. Dr. Lyon worked with Dr. Lohman at the University of Iowa to develop CogAT Form 7 and came on as a co-author for CogAT Form 8. Dr. Lakin's recently moved over to the University of Alabama as an associate professor in the Department of Educational Studies. Her particular interests are in test validity and fairness, and she's particularly interested in the work around making tests accessible for English language learners and other kinds of traditionally underserved populations, which works perfectly with what we're trying to do here at CogAT. Her other primary research interest is around STEM education, and Riverside's currently working with Joni on some interesting ideas about how STEM education and placement intersects with testing, so stay tuned for that. Before I turn the session over to Drs. Lyon and Lyon, I want to give you a brief introduction as to why we at Riverside find the work being done in Mankato so compelling. Because I know we have a bunch of people who just joined, I will also remind you again, we are recording the session and we will send out a link to the recording to everyone who registered for the session, as well as if you have questions while we're going along, please enter them into the question panel, and we will try to get to your questions through the course of the conversation today, or we're going to leave some time at the end for questions. Okay, so let me move into my slides here. I'm going to give a brief introduction, and then we're going to have a conversation with Dr. Tanya Lyon from Mankato, Minnesota Area Public Schools, and Dr. Joni Lyon, our CogAT co-author. Some of the topics that we're going to talk about with respect to what's going on at MAPS is how they've changed their practices around identification and services. What steps did they take? What role does having an ability measure as part of their matrix serve? How do they use multiple pathways for program entry, as well as targeting those pathways into diversified programs to best meet student needs? And then how has their program been affected this year by the pandemic? Because like all of us, they've been affected. So this is a little summary I wrote, and yes, I'm going to bore you to death by reading this slide to you, but this is really how we summarize this session. Hear firsthand the story of one district's drive for equity and their successful implementation of diversified programming and differentiated identification strategies to serve more children more effectively. Dr. Tanya Lyon from Mankato Area Public Schools will discuss how the redesign of their identification protocol and program of services have created more opportunities for every student and greatly increased representation among traditionally underserved groups in their gifted and talented programs. MAPS implemented universal screening with CogAT, multiple pathways to identify students ready for greater challenge, and programs with varied levels of service to best nurture student potential. And then we will also talk about how the special challenges of COVID-19 this year have affected their team's work to identify and serve students. So here's my little introduction for part of why we are so excited to be working with MAPS, Mankato Area Public Schools. The folks at UConn, the National Center for Research on Gifted Education, a couple of years ago put out a list which they call the 15 tips for identifying English language learner students. But when we took a look at these 15 tips, we said, you know, not only are these best practices for ELs, these are best practices for every student. And Mankato really serves as a model of how these kinds of best practices can be infused through a program. They truly provide kind of a recipe or a list of steps of here are all the things that you want to make sure that you're doing so that you have the best way to reach all of your students. And a little bit about the group at UConn. It's not just researchers from the University of Connecticut, but also Michigan State, Berkeley, the University of Iowa, which is where Joni originally came out of. The University of Wisconsin-Whitewater, which is, I think, Scott Peterson. Many of you may be aware of Scott, and the University of Santa Cruz. So they all work together at this research center where they look at best practices on gifted and talented identification. So what are some of the best practices? And they're kind of, I've kind of lumped them into groups here. So they have 15 of them, but universal screening is an important one. And research has shown that universal screening is first and foremost the most important thing that we can do to create equity. So moving away from a referral model to a universal screening model. Select your assessment instruments carefully and make sure that you take account of cultural sensitivities and language differences. I'm going to jump down to number 4, which is including reliable and valid nonverbal ability assessments. And what they mean by nonverbal here is it's not an item type. It's that you're able to administer an assessment without requiring specific language. And that's something we've worked really hard at with CogAT. Using other identification tools to supplement the results of your universal screening. So identifying students really isn't just a one and done. Using ability and achievement assessments as indicators of potential giftedness in the native language whenever possible. So for instance, number 7 on the list is you could work with multilingual school psychologists. That's one way to access that. Establish a preparation program or a talent development pool. And this is something that they've done at Mankato as well. Not only are they working on getting students ready for it, but then once they, if you see step number 9 here, have found their talent pool, they monitor those students closely. They give them multiple opportunities to make it into the program, and it's an ongoing process rather than a single event. They also have an identification committee. So a web of communication, an entire group of people who have different roles in these students' lives and different views into these students. So you're getting a full perspective. Making an outreach to the community is important, to parents as well as your teaching community and your other staff members. You want to collaborate across all of the departments in your team. So whether it's gen ed, whether it's special ed, whether it's ESL, whether it's gifted and talented, every single person in that ecosystem, your educational ecosystem, is one of the collaborators who's important to this process. And then professional development is an important part of it. So part of that is helping your local staff understand what kinds of skills you're looking for and how students can be developed. Part of it is developing a systematic approach for analyzing your local demographics, understanding what your identified population looks like, what your talent pool population looks like, and how you can level the playing field where it needs to be leveled. And then last but not least, promoting efforts to diversify your teaching staff when you can, so that students see in the schools people that they can model and understand what's possible for themselves. So there are a number of these key practices that we're going to talk about today with respect to what goes on in Mankato. So I want to formally introduce you to Dr. Lyon, as well as bring on Dr. Lakin, and we will have a conversation. And these are some of the topics that I introduced that we're going to talk about. So I can leave this slide up, and how would we like to start, ladies?
Well, I'd like to start by thanking Tanya for joining us. I'm really excited to co-present with her again like last year at NAGC. That was a great session. I just sat down and listened the whole time, so it's a little annoying that I have to contribute this year. I'll kick off though and ask Tanya, because I know that, there was a long period of kind of self-evaluation and thinking about how you could improve. What was really the motivation for changing your identification practices and services at Mankato?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. It's great to be here and to be with both of you and to have an audience joining us. So I'm just really excited to share a little bit about our journey, because I know from my work in the field of gifted and talented education that Mankato area public schools, our journey is not unique to Mankato. It reflects broader patterns in society and broader patterns in education. And so, that when I enter into conversations around some of these issues, I learn from those broader patterns and hopefully can contribute some insights of one approach that might be helpful to others in dealing with some of those broader patterns as well. So our journey, I'm a longtime educator in this district. I started teaching at one of the high schools, and that was like 25 years ago. And I remember there were parents at that time who were upset about the gifted and talented education program that their children were a part of. And they were so relieved when kids finally got to really grade 11. And that's when they felt like their children were challenged for the first time. And so some of those needs around gifted and talented education were really long-term needs at the elementary, middle, and high school level in different ways. A superintendent, and I will also say that those crossed numerous superintendents as well, but a superintendent decided at one point then that she was going to make sure that something was done. And to make that happen, our superintendent, her name is Dr. Sherry Allen, she reached out to the University of St. Thomas to do an external review and had Dr. Karen Rogers and Dr. Karen Westberg engage in that over the course of a year. And it was a very comprehensive program review that probably in the time of COVID would not take place because it was a luxury at that time. But what we really understand is that we had needs all over our system. Needs in communication, needs in identification, needs in who was served by our program. Our program was serving middle and upper class white students. Needs in terms of curriculum. Our curriculum was not strong, and our math had more strength than anything else, but our reading had lots and lots of holes, and our reading was in pretty dire need of challenge. And we also learned that our identification process, and I think that anyone with a background in identification would recognize how problematic it was. It was with one measure of academic progress, or NWEA score, and 1 year someone would be in, and then they might go down 2 points, and then not be in, and people were bouncing all over in and out of the program, and sometimes the students in most need of challenge were not being identified. And so there were just really a whole host of problems that came out of this external review. I would also say that another fairly important issue was that there were many, many different understandings of what gifted and talented education was that were part of the district. And some of those were rooted in different philosophical pieces that actually exist, and some of those ideas were existing in bad practice and myths and misconceptions. And so and some of those myths and misconceptions were really dearly held beliefs by educators. And so that's really kind of sets the stage to where we were when the external review was done in 2013 and 2014. And so we also had parents at that time, some of whom knew their children were being served, and some of whom never could get a straight answer whether their children were being served. And we have in our district, we serve about 8,500 students, maybe a little less right now. And some schools had strong programming and some schools did not. I would probably say it was even less about a school and more about a classroom. And so classroom, it was contingent, serving a student was contingent upon the teacher. Our teachers were doing the best they could with what they had. We had no real professional development plan or training that went around with it, along with gifted services. And so some of those misconceptions were also part of our educators as well. And that really provided powerful feedback, excuse me, powerful feedback for our district to take a real look at changing. And we often say in our district, all means all. That we serve all students. And so this is a part, our gifted and talented is part of all means all. And so we started really with making a change. We hired an instructional coach in reading, an instructional coach in math, and then a full-time talent development coordinator, which was me. And we moved quickly once we got those results. At that point, the federal Javits grant was re-up after a period of hiatus, and Dr. Westberg and Dr. Rogers thought that there were a lot of things that were really good about working with our district, and so they asked if we wanted to partner, and that was shortly after I came onto this position. What we did in partnership with the Javits grant was not anything we weren't going to do, but what it does was it sped up the process and increased the number of resources. And that's information that is, in many ways publicly available, and that we've tried to share out as much as possible so that other people benefit from the knowledge that took place in that grant. So that's the starting point. And we started by then, our first pathway was like, what are we going to do to start changing the trajectory? And so there were a couple things that happened simultaneously. One was I knew we had to address those different belief systems that were in the district. So I created an advisory committee that included community members as well as students, and then a task force which was made up of educators for talent development. And then I designed kind of a process to both share with them different models of gifted education and what were the strengths and weaknesses of each of those models, got feedback, went through a process of building a really what is it that we believe about kids that can be the philosophy that is the foundation for the way we serve students. And we decided as a community we wanted a broad umbrella that kids could be qualify and served for gifted education, both through nature and what gifts and talents that just seem to exist in them, sometimes from birth or even before birth. And then that nurture was also important in creating pathways. And so that was happening simultaneously as we were starting the process of building systems and structures. And the first thing we had to do really to do that was determine what it is that our services were going to look like. Because you can't create an identification process unless you know what you're going to. And the identification process has to match the service so that you match the kids to get the right kids for the right service. And so we then spent really a few months really kind of pounding out what it is that our services are going to look like. And I know, like many districts, we work on what we call the response to intervention model, but some districts call it multi-tiered services support system. And so really what we started doing was we started defining those things. And that is kind of a long answer to that question. But it wasn't until we knew we had a philosophy and we knew what our services were going to look like. They were going to be standards-based that increased complexity. That's kind of a foundational piece to challenge students. And so that when students knew the standards, whether they were formally identified or not, we had options for kids to go into for meaningful learning that challenged them. And then it was at that point we could design an identification process that really took into account multiple measures and really balanced kids' strengths with multiple pathways into that program, and tried to develop not a defensive gatekeeper program, but a system that helped us make that best match based on the information that we had. District-wide too, a kind of a philosophy of ours was that we didn't want to put the burden on the student to demonstrate that we wanted to use what we knew about kids and do it in an ethical way to best identify them. And I think with that, I'm gonna just see where people wanna go with it, because that was a long foundational piece.
Well, we were setting you up to just share that introduction. I mean, one thing I love about your story is that you do start with the services and work your way back. You know, we talk about reverse engineering the identification process, and also addressing misconceptions about gifted and talented. I think that's so important. And many of these interventions, these improvements can't be made if people don't agree on what we're trying to do. So, I mean, I think that's a wonderful demonstration. I think
well,
maybe
there's just a couple things I want to mention.
Talking about the method first. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, there's just a couple of things that I want to mention that your introduction made me think of, Tanya, which I know from having this conversation with you previously. One thing that I think was really helpful, you know, it's great to have the university expertise to help you as part of the grant, but I think something else that was important is that you had tremendous support from your superintendent, which we know is helpful. And I also think, you know, you've kind of laid out the pattern. You know, it's this whole jigsaw, and maybe a multi-dimensional jigsaw that you were putting together. But the key thing about it is that I know that you all have worked to continually refine your services. So it's not, if we approach it like, I will get this perfect the first time, that's kind of false thinking, because it still needs further you know, further enhancement as we go along, and we refine and retune, and we refine and we tune. And you know, we've heard from you that you've done all that. So yeah, Joni, let me step back and let you have at it.
Well, I was just going to say, if Tanya, you could briefly talk about the different pathways that you identify, because so many districts, you know, they have the gifted program, and there's such an interest in front-loading programs, so programs for students who maybe aren't ready for identification or before that stage of education. So what are the different pathways and services that you introduced as part of this revolution?
Yep. So I'm going to start by talking about our services, because that's the broadest possible look at that, and then go into some of the more specific things regarding identification and those services. So we developed a cluster program. Again, this fits in philosophically to our response to intervention model, and we do deliberately place students, and I'm going to zero in on math. Or not math, elementary and the first part of middle school, because our services, formalized services, start in grade 3. And when we identify for the first round of universal screening at the end of 2nd grade. And then at the end of 6th grade, we go through another universal screening process for grades 7 and 8. And then at grade 9 and beyond, it's self-selected. And so we're kind of doing a gradual release there of identification too, which I think actually is really important, especially as I see how kids respond to services. So within those services, in elementary school, we have, I'm going to just focus on our formalized services at grade 3 that start there. We have a math cluster and a reading cluster, and then we have a Rising Scholar program. And all of those are clustered services within our elementary schools, where we are placing kids deliberately together with similar needs. And our math and reading cluster is our advanced academic service in each of those areas. Many students are served in both, but some of them are served in one or the other. And then our Rising Scholars is for our historically underrepresented students in gifted and talented education. And I see that slide is up right now, so I'm going to talk a little bit about Rising Scholars because it's one of, I think, a really important program that we have. And I want to say that our Rising Scholars program is always exactly parallel as much as possible to our advanced academic programs, which would be the math and the reading cluster. And so anytime we are communicating about our advanced academic track, we are also communicating about our Rising Scholar. We are using the same language as much as possible. To summarize the major difference in language, the major difference in language is that our cluster students are ones who have been identified for advanced academic services, and our Rising Scholars are students we are getting ready to, we are preparing them for identification for our advanced academics and providing them additional support in the classroom in math, in reading, and in a pull-out social, emotional, affective support piece that is run through the guidance counselors at every elementary school. And so when we identify, again, that parallel process is so important. So when we are identifying, we start by identifying for our advanced academics. And what we use is we use the CogAT. And we use that as our ability measure, which tells us different information than our achievement measure, which would be our measures of academic progress. Because we're MAPs, we call them NWEA scores. That's what we use. But I know the rest of the world uses them, it knows them as measures of academic progress. But it gets confusing to talk about MAP scores in MAPs otherwise, and we don't know what we're talking about. So those achievement tests are also very important. And when we talk about, when we're looking at this, certainly we have students who have, very similar lines of scores where, like they're 99, 99, 99, 99, no matter what measure we're talking about. But then there are other students that have like the high CogAT score and the lower achievement scores. And those are really important students to get on our radar. And that's really one of the things that CogAT helps us see. It is a different type of student. And we often have to look at whether or not they should be in advanced academic tracks at that point, or programming or services, whatever word you want to use there. Or do they need additional support in order to be able to succeed in those programs? And so there are multiple ways we get at that, from using teacher feedback to field testing, to talking to the people that know the students best on the ground level, because that placement becomes really critical for whether the long-term success. Some students are ready academically for the services, but social emotionally, and we know that those students probably are going to be better served in our Rising Scholar program. So our identification process is going to be parallel. We're always thinking about math cluster, reading cluster, Rising Scholars, and we start with the advanced academic service, and we have our clear-cut top students there. We put our students into a statistical spreadsheet that involves changing percentiles to z-scores, and we have created a formula that we use so that all students are looked at in the same way as a starting point. And then generally what we do is we use the top 10% as a starting point. And as part of our multiple pathways with cluster students, we then move into that borderline group and see whether they need to be in a cluster service or whether they would be better with core curriculum. And the patterns, I see we've got the multiple pathways. We really have pathways that have room for that high CogAT or high CogAT and the high achievement scores, high CogAT, low achievement, low CogAT, high achievement. And really that's kind of the umbrella for nature and nurture, some of the kids get in through nature there, some of them get in through nurture. And then when we go to Rising Scholars, we have pathways that are even broader, and so we really look at Once we get into that borderline, we color code students by scores and determine cut score like 85th percentile or above, and we color code these spreadsheets, and we watch for gaps, we look for patterns. You know, after we get out of that borderline group, we still go through the rest of the spreadsheet. Are there kids that look like they need the service? And it's very labor intensive on the front end of what we do. On the back end, it is not nearly as labor intensive to do it that way as it is to solve problems afterwards about just being absolute, this person being that gatekeeper as this person is in or out, but really looking for that match. That is a mindset to look for the match of which student is going to be benefit from the service. How do we know that from the data or the information that we have, and be less about absolutes. And we've done a much better job over time the more we have done that systematically. We still work through a systematic process, but then when we start handling all of the situations where we see gaps between the CogAT and the achievement scores, you know, like what is the systematic way to do this so that all of these students who have this background are treated the same way in similar ways? And if we learn that they are good matches, what do we do with them? And so, and I really believe that fuzzy thinking, you know, around identification is something that is leads to issues later on. So there are people who want, I signed out a room, and I'm sorry, there are people who seem to want to be in this room, so I'm a little distracted. But that's really kind of what we do. And then once we are done with our cluster and our math and reading cluster students, we move to Rising Scholars, and we do, again, the same process. We open it up further, as you can see by the 4 bullet points there. Again, we have the same multiple pathways or similar multiple pathways: higher CogAT, higher achievement, higher CogAT, lower achievement, lower CogAT, higher achievement, lower CogAT, lower achievement. And there's pathways for all of those students to get in. And then we also evaluate the any student whose home language is other than English. And our EL students, we review all of them individually and look at what the data tells us, because we know, you know, sometimes we can see that a student is a great match based on how fast they're learning English. And I think I'll open it up for questions now, because that was a lot of information in one chunk too.
And I hope I haven't made it more distracting by kind of hopping around your slides. What we can do is, these are the same slides that were provided as a handout at our NAGC session last year. And so we can include these when we follow up with folks and send out the link to the recording. We can send you a PDF of these slides. I had one quick question, which was back in the before, because I know one of the things you all have implemented is universal screening. Were you a referral model previously?
We were on a 1 data point measure of academic progress, and it was like at the 93rd percentile or something like that. And so if they got it, they were in 1 year at the 93rd percentile. If they went down to the 92nd percentile, they weren't. We didn't, and there were reports that if people were squeaky wheels, they got their kids services. And that was in our write-up that we had to address that. And that's part of the creation of a systematic process. My role in my leadership has also been to make it as little about parent advocacy and more about what it is we know at the school level to prevent the need for parents having to advocate for their children to get what they need. And parent advocacy still comes into play, and it's an avenue as well, but to decrease parent advocacy as much as possible by being responsive to what kids needed. So, and I think we've done that. Our appeals, we have an ongoing appeals process, and over the years, fewer and fewer people are taking advantage of it because we've gotten better and better at it.
That's awesome.
So, you know, you mentioned too that you were looking at your achievement measure and you were using a hard cut score, and so you've implemented some universal screening with CogAT. So what does a having an ability measure in the mix bring to it that's different for you?
Oh, that's just a really powerful comment, I think, because we can see the kids most likely to think beyond grade level in terms of complexity, in terms of strategy, in terms of cause-effect sequence thinking, cause-effect analysis, compare contrast, higher level thinking skills. Things that, you know, the way we explain it to families is that you don't have to study for some of these things, that they are problem solving abilities and logical reasoning and those types of things. And so when we see those things being high, even when our achievement testing is low, those are students that we want to start working with. They can and often learn very quickly the curricular pieces, and that can be a sign that we can work with these students differently, because when they have those abilities, we can tap into those as strengths and build some of the you know, less, I don't want to call it less demanding because it's demanding still learning, but we can fill in some of the curriculum gaps sometimes very, very quickly with those students when we know. And oftentimes, you know, we have things that are behavioral issues that we have to sort through as well. And understanding that, I think the CogAT helps us to sometimes make a correlation between students who are acting out and students who would need additional challenge. And so we get a lot from the CogAT. I feel like we continue to probe what that means over time.
So I know we didn't even explicitly say we were going to talk about this, but I think one thing folks would be interested to hear is, like, what has this meant for you all in terms of results? Because one of the important things you mentioned in the intro, we were serving white kids. And you know, one of the things that you told us is implementing these new processes and programs has helped change that for you. So what does it look like now?
Well, so the students we are serving in talent development is getting closer to mirroring our overall population, and the younger we go, the more that closely that is happening. Especially, actually, some of our most profound changes have occurred since the Javits grant ended, and we you know, during the time we were in the Javits grant around identification, we were being, you know, very close to systematic to be able to understand from a research perspective what these changes yielded. And after the Javits grant ended, we had built up some systems knowledge that it was time to take advantage of that was less rigid than some of the structures around research, and yet very precise and systematic. And so really opening up, I would say, you know, over time, you know, that even between last year when we were presenting jointly and this year, the EL and home language process is something, because of COVID this year, we ended up doing with all of our underserved students, as we looked at all of them that weren't identified at the end of the process, that weren't yet identified. We just went through to look, are we missing any kids in this range? How do we understand the CogAT with the ability or the achievement scores, and can we learn anything that would tell us kids might be good matches, particularly for our Rising Scholar program?
And so you've actually opened the door to, you know, one of the things that when we touched base this fall, one of the things that we first asked you was, how you doing? And you guys have actually chugged along quite well, but, you know, one of the gaps that you mentioned in your process was not everybody did their achievement testing last year. So what other kind of impacts have you had, and how have you dealt with it?
Yeah, so we were really lucky last year that we got our CogAT testing done by the end of February. And so 2 weeks later, when we entered into quarantine and distance learning, we had those scores for identification. And so what we ended up doing was because our CogAT score was the most recent data point that we had, we ended up putting more weight on it this past year. And we did not do our measures of academic progress uh, last spring because of the the pandemic. And so we used the information we had from kindergarten and first grade and from our CogAT. And then what we did was we used that as a starting point. We did rely more on teacher feedback this year than we typically do because we did not have current data points. And we just, whenever we had data, we used it. And I think when the CogAT became more important, as did some of the gaps between the CogAT and achievement scores, particularly for our underserved students, it was really hard not to have a current data point because from an achievement score perspective, because, when we think about the excellence gap and opportunity gaps, we were missing a critical year of that. And so we really just had to take that into account and find out information in other ways. Sometimes it came through principals, sometimes it came through teachers, most often through teachers, but sometimes through our mentor coaches that were in the buildings or in the online environment building, and sometimes through classroom observations. We did less field testing and more information gathering this year from teachers, just because of COVID and its impact on us. But I feel that, knowing what we know about defensible systems, we had a defensible system. We grouped kids together. When we have this type of student who may show the potential to be a part of one of these services, how do we handle them? So we're handling all of the kids who have that same pattern in a fair way, and that we know why or why not they are not in services. And the more, like I always say, the more questions that we have, the more we need to work to find the answers to them, because if we don't answer the questions in the process, the questions are going to come out sideways and be lots of times part of messy situations later.
Well, speaking of questions, we've got some good ones.
Okay.
So one person asked, at what point you started, since identification, the model and the curriculum are all connected. But I feel like we've answered that question. You really started by thinking about the services, and then backed into how you were going to identify students for that. And someone asked what achievement test you were using, and we've answered that question. So another question is,
repeat it in case they didn't hear it. So they use NWEA map.
Yeah, they're using NWEA, but I mean,
Yeah.
there are a variety of achievement tests that can be used. So,
And the way I think about our identification and the fact that we use achievement scores, achievement scores really are part of the standards, right? The standards are our curriculum. Achievement tests give us insights into the standards and how students are doing on the standards and the curriculum that goes with the standards. The CogAT gives us that problem solving logical reasoning piece. And when I say that ability to think beyond grade level, when I think about matching students with our resources and our services, that the CogAT does their likelihood to succeed when that becomes very complex. And so talking about those things, I think like that, so you can really see how our identification process measures different things and pulls them together to be a combination of a snapshot of students who are most likely to benefit from those services, relates to those questions.
in fact, we had someone ask the question. They were more interested to hear more about how you developed the matrix. And you guys have a very, very specific process that you do. And one of the things that you do is you don't weight achievement higher than ability or vice versa. You kind of look at everything on an equal scale. There's also more information available on that. We did a case study with you guys last year, and we published a little piece, and that's available on our Riverside website. What we can do is we can also attach that when we send out the link to the recording, as well as the PDF of the slides. We have a
Vicki,
couple.
can I piggyback
Yeah,
back on that question?
please
So
do.
Tanya, when you do this matrix review, how many people are involved in that? How many different experts are digging in the data with you?
Well, it's a small group, unfortunately. But it
It'll
is.
make our listeners feel better if it's a small group, so that's perfect.
Yeah. So we've typically had 2 talent development coaches, a reading coach and a math, and then me. And so it's been 3 people on the team. Next year, we're going to have to change what that looks like, because we're down to, this year, we're down to 2 people on the team. And both of us our jobs have gotten bigger over the course of this year. And so I think what I'm going to do is design a process that looks at it district-wide, where that other person and I work with that. And then when we go and once we get through the district-wide identification, I might work with the instructional coach that is in each building around what has happened, and look at the students in the building and which students have we, identified, which students have we missed, and how do we need to look at them. And that will build capacity in a different way within the district as well. So hopefully still 3 people, but it's going to look different.
Yeah, right, thanks.
And we had a question. So we had a question about expanding on the rising scholar identification pathway of lower CogAT, lower achievement, and what does lower really mean? And I think one of the things that we haven't talked about is, I believe you all have infused some local norms into your program as well, haven't you? And maybe that interacts with this idea. So what does
Absolutely.
lower really mean?
Lower can mean really low. But you have to understand your local norms and how you're using them. So on our CogAT, we understand that our CogAT is locally normed. I always find it very helpful to understand how our local norms compare to the national norms, because it helps me use the local norms scale better. So for example, if a student is at the 75th percentile on a local norms scale, and I know that on a national scale, that person might be at a 90th percentile, that tells me something different than if at our local norm score, the student's at the 75th percentile, and on the national scale, that student's at the 60th percentile. So it does help us to be able to navigate that. So really understanding the locally normed scale that you're using, and from my perspective, understanding where there are big differences between the national scale and our local scale, and when there are small differences, is really helpful. When we're talking about EL students or underserved learners, like if we have a CogAT score that is really high, but we have really low achievement scores, we're going to dig and get more information. We're not going to keep a person out because they have low achievement scores, but it might give us pause. And so we really have to probe those examples. In EL students, we might have students who are at the 80th percentile on the CogAT, and they may have a achievement score that's significantly lower than that. Or 2, but let's say they got at the 23rd percentile one year and the 53rd percentile in their achievement scores the next year, with a 30-point jump and a high CogAT. We're going to do some digging and say, what, this student is still not, technically qualifying on achievement scores, but look at this jump as this person is learning language, and they're often great students to be able to pull into that Rising Scholar service. And so I would say that over time, we have gotten much more comfortable with low being part of the picture when we are taking a look at all the data that we have. And sometimes that means going into our DIBELS data and some of our other data, just to kind of see where jumps are occurring. And it sounds, again, very laborious. We actually have been able to figure out it is a lot of steps, but we've also been able to figure out how to move those very quickly by handling them systematically. And so we can get identification done for all 3 services within, including gathering data, within a 2 to 3 week time period.
So we had a couple of questions that kind of came in around that same idea. You just mentioned DIBELS, and so one person said, you know, what are you looking at in terms of other tools? Are you using things like the scales of identification for gifted services? You know, what other, are you using your state test data? And another person said, what's your vehicle for feedback from teachers? And I see those two questions kind of related. So how do you manage those?
For feedback for teachers, because we get that through the Scripps scales, or the Renzulli scales as they're often called. You know, like the Hope scale could be very good. There's all sorts of scales that can be really, really helpful for specifically for underserved students. And so those, I would recommend using any of those that are valid and well tested and that sort of thing. And so we use those. We also, if we have a step in our process where we send out the list of identified students to the teachers of that grade level and say, if you have concerns about these students, please fill out the rating scales, and that would be the Renzulli scales that we use. And that is a process that we say, if a student needs services, in your opinion, and is not on our list, you can nominate the student by filling out the rating scale on the student. And every year we get students that way who are identified as well. We have tried to eliminate as much of the work on the teacher's part as possible because their jobs are so complicated, but also keep the pathways open for their feedback when it means the most to us. And so those are great questions. And there are times where teacher feedback might be telling us that they have a concern about the student being placed, and everything about the scale that comes back says the student needs services based on what we know about research and gifted education. So that's a really complex way of doing that. And sometimes we are able to go and have conversations with teachers around that the behavior pieces that they are seeing very well could be due to lack of challenge.
Well, we have 2 minutes left, and I know you've already had people queuing at your doorway, Tanya. So very quickly, one person asked about the cluster program, and then I have one more question I want to get to after this. What does it look like? Is it an entire classroom of reading or math identified students at each grade level? So what does the cluster program look like?
Out there, we try to put them, schools are in charge of scheduling, and so they sometimes have to deviate based on their needs at a building and their teacher needs and their FTEs and that sort of thing. But we recommend 5 to 7 in the classroom, and typically we train the teachers who work with those, and we try to follow the same thing with Rising Scholars, although sometimes the Rising Scholars get split up a little bit more because of some of the needs for support. And we have found that we can run a Rising Scholar program as effectively if the students are broken up and they are all together for their social emotional support.
So I want to close with one that came in that is touching my heart, because I think we all feel this one. What suggestion would you make to a school where there is only one AIG certified teacher who teaches AIG resource, coordinates the testing, coordinates the parent contact meetings, and plans the lessons? We have pathways, but it's based on nominations and not universal screening, which seems like a great idea. I'm overwhelmed. So if we were going to give this person one suggestion, one place to start, what might we suggest?
Oh my goodness. I really think that with that person, we need to build support from the superintendent or the principal for that person, and really start looking at shared services and shared responsibility for delivering those services between that person who is the expert and every teacher who sees those students. And maybe that person, does some PD, or the district can do some PD around it to develop what that shared responsibility looks like and shared leadership around meeting those needs, because that one person is bearing really an impossible job as is, and the only way to meet the kids' needs is to get more people involved in it.
Well, we are at time. I know we could go, because we have in the past, we could go on for like 4 hours. But I'm conscious of how important everybody's time is, and we all have other things we have to get to today. So this was our kickoff from Here for Your Peers. After the NAGC conference happens next week, we want to start coming back with some other folks who are doing really interesting work, and bring that to you folks. We will send out some follow-up information after this session, and please join our Facebook group. We'll send you an invitation to that so that you can talk to each other as well as to us. Watch our blog posts for other upcoming events, and thank
You
you,
want to mention our
Tanya.
sessions at NAGC?
Yeah, so we have sessions coming up next week.
Yeah, so check the NAGC schedule, because those have been really
Yes,
good.
we have one on Wednesday afternoon. No, it's Wednesday morning and Thursday afternoon, I think. We have a couple sessions coming up, and Tanya will have sessions at NAGC as well this year, won't you?
Yeah.
So as always, it's an absolute pleasure to hear from you, and that's the best part about this job, is working with the people who are really doing the work, and you are really doing the work. So
Thank you, Tanya.
thank you all, and we'll talk again soon. Bye, everybody.
Thank you.